I want to move on now to this moment about 8 Men Speak, which was this play. And unfortunately, I have to give you a bit of background because it's about a very particular political incident. So I have to give you a little bit of background on the incident. So after the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike, the government proclaimed and enacted 2 very important and draconian pieces of legislation in order to deter labor organization. Section 41 of the Immigration Act allowed officials to deport any alien or Canadian citizen not born in Canada for advocating the overthrow of the government by force. Trade unionists and communists by the hundreds were deported through this legislation. In 1931 to 1932, deportations peaked at 7,000. 7,000 people a year through this period of time being kicked out of Canada for organizing labor and being members of the Communist Party. To complement this, this immigration section was a new section of the criminal code that was enacted called Section 98. And Section 98 of the criminal code included the general provision that any association whose professed purpose is to bring about any governmental, industrial, or economic change within Canada by use of force, violence, or physical injury to person or property, or by threats of such injury, or which teaches, advocates, advises, or defends the use of force, violence, terrorism, or physical injury to person or property in order to accomplish such change or for any other purpose, which shall by any means persecute or pursue such purpose, or shall so teach, advocate, advise, or defend, shall be an unlawful association. So in other words, anything that they wanted could pretty well be turned into an unlawful association. This was and so Section 98 characterized a member of an unlawful association as someone who had attended meetings, spoken out in favor of, or distributed literature for an organization. So if radical arts history was an unlawful organization, we'd all be in trouble. We could all be deported if we hadn't been, even if we were Canadian citizens, right? If we hadn't been born here. And the rest of us could be thrown in jail. So it was, this was, in fact, in many ways, one of the central civil rights battles of the 30s in Canada was to get Section 98 repealed. There were 3 prosecutions emerged from Section 98, the most famous being the trial of 8 members of the Communist Party of Canada in 1931. In Regina versus Buck, the Ontario Court of Appeal held that the provisions of Section 98 were broad enough to include members of the Communist Party under the definition of an unlawful association. So in other words, they had decided that being a member of the Communist Party of Canada was enough to get you thrown in jail. And on August 11th of 1931, the Communist Party offices in Toronto were raided, and Tim Buck, who was the head of the Communist Party of Canada at the time, and 7 of his colleagues were arrested and charged with sedition. They were all convicted of sedition and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Tim Buck they were all of them in prison from 1932 to 1934 in Kingston Penitentiary, and Tim Buck was the target of an apparent assassination attempt in his cell during the night of a prison riot. While Buck was sitting in his cell listening to the melee outside, because he claimed he never participated in this riot at all. In fact, he's a contradictory character as Tim Buck, but nevertheless, he was against the prisoners' riot. His methods were somewhat different. So while Buck was sitting in his cell listening to the melee outside, 8 shots were fired into his cell via a window, narrowly missing him. In late 1933, the Minister of Justice admitted in the House of Commons that shots had been deliberately fired into Buck's cell, but just to frighten him. And the guard who people presume who did the shooting was never tried, and that was sort of swept under the table. And in support of the Kingston 8, and in favor of the repeal of Section 98 of the Criminal Code, the Workers' Experimental Theatre developed and presented this play called 8 Men Speak. And to quote Toby Ryan, it had everything from realism to expressionism to mass chants to melodrama, to a mock trial to more sophisticated lighting which projected shadows on the cyclorama. I don't know if you could call it a play in the conventional sense. It was really kind of a collage. And it is a fascinating mess. It's great. It just jumps all over the place. I really, in our sort of sensibility, where we're not so sort of fixated on sort of good order. It's a lot of fun. It actually because it has so much action. It has 6 acts. It starts with a comic scene with the warden of the Kingston Penitentiary having a garden party, and it's sort of, there's a British torch singer, and it's, and a United Church or an Anglican minister who is, will do anything the prison guards tell him to do, and all this sort of stuff. Then it moves on to sections about sort of this kind of paranoid fear of Tim Buck and his associates, and then there's the prison riot, which we don't actually see. And they do a kind of an interesting sort of cinematic series of blackout scenes where misinformation about the prison riot spreads across the country. So we have it must have been the communists, and it spreads. And then you see, you hear a radio announcer talking about the communists rioting in the prisons, and it was Tim Buck, it was all this, and it spreads across the country, and as it gets into people's homes and how they react to it. It then included a trial of the guard who was named X, who was defended by a lawyer named Capitalism. And the defense lawyer in 8 Men Speak, who's actually the prosecutor, is called the Canadian Defense Civil Defense Team, CDLC. That's her name. A mass recitation was included by dead workers who had been killed by police in Saskatchewan. So not really related to the Tim Buck incident in Kingston Pen. And then, which is probably, for me, the most powerful scene in the show, a mass recitation by the 8 communists from their cells of Kingston Penitentiary. So that's where we get the title, 8 Men Speak. So it's 8 men speak from their cells, from where we're walking from. And during this mass chant, they tell a bit about their stories and why they were arrested and who they are and that kind of stuff. And so the play required approximately 30 actors, which was much, much larger than the Workers' Experimental Theatre had ever attempted to use before. And so the Workers' Experimental Theatre was supplemented by members of the Unemployed Workers' Council. So they basically went down to the Unemployed Workers' Hall and said, anybody want to be in a play? And a bunch of them said yes. And generally speaking, they were there all the time. People like Toby Ryan talk about how dedicated they were. These are guys who had to walk 2 or 3 miles to a rehearsal because they couldn't afford cab fare. Couldn't afford bus fare. Right? Couldn't afford to get on the streetcar at this point. So they were walking 2 or 3 miles to get to rehearsal. They rehearsed for about 2 months, from October to December. And for all of this work, we get 1 performance. There was 1 performance on December 3rd of 1933 for an audience of about 1,500 people at the Standard Theatre, which is at the corner of Spadina and Dundas. It later turned into the Victory Theatre, which has had other uses later on in its history, and is now gone. So for those of us who have been in Toronto for 25 years, it was the Burlesque Hall down at Spadina and Dundas. The response was so great that they planned a 2nd performance. However, rather than banning the play, the Police Commission in Toronto and the Licensing Commission of Theatres threatened to revoke the theatrical license of any space that rented to the show. So that they booked the Standard Theatre again for February, and a week or so before the date of the performance, the owner of the Standard Theatre was hauled in front of the Police Commission and told that he would lose his license if he allowed this play to go on. And the result was that no one would rent to the company after that, and that's why there's really only 1 performance. And there was, interestingly enough, there was a similar, almost identical experience in Winnipeg, where the performance was actually canceled 1 day before it was to be performed by having the license of the theatre threatened with revocation. The Walker Theatre, which is actually sort of very nice. It's kind of the Royal Alex of Winnipeg. So it was, but they couldn't rent it anymore.